are over.
Yes, yes. That must be a great trial to you, of all people. Was it the war?
No. A tiger mauled my arm. It turned septic and had to be taken off at the shoulder. I'm lucky to be alive at all.
Yes, I'm immensely ignorant about tiger hunting. Tell me, you go out on elephants with beaters, don't you?
Pardon me, Mr. Holmes, but I must ask the Colonel a few questions.
Yes, all right, just a minute. I'm very interested in tiger hunting.
Well, elephants and beaters are used when royalty and rajas hunt tigers, but they're expensive. Oh, very. You can always tether a goat and wait till the tiger comes for it.
Really, Mr. Holmes, I'm pressed for time, and I must ask the Colonel a few questions.
Yeah, well, fire ahead, Lester, fire ahead.
You were the last to see the deceased alive.
Yes, he's been very nervy since last night. He came round this evening and asked me to come back with him for a chat. I suppose you all know what happened at the bridge party.
Yes?
One of the players looked like being unpleasant, and Adair wanted my advice.
And what was your advice?
To do nothing at all. Even if it were true, nobody could prove it.
And he was less worried when you left?
I think he was, a little.
I understand a new suitcase was brought to the house last night. Were you there when it arrived?
I believe so. I never saw it, but I heard Ronnie tell Marson to take it into his bedroom.
What time did you leave?
About 9:45.
And within 3/4 of an hour, he was found dead.
Surely it's obvious he shot himself.
I disagree, my dear Watson. He was murdered.
Of course.
You don't really think so?
Yes, my dear Colonel. I'm certain of it. And what is more, I'm sure you'll all be glad to hear that within 24 hours, I shall not only be in a position to prove it, but I shall have the murderer under lock and key.
I'm delighted to hear it. Not that it can bring the poor lad back. You know, Ronnie, with all his faults, was extraordinarily lovable. I feel rather as if I had lost a son.
Thank you, Colonel Henslow. I shan't need you any more. Would you mind asking Mr. Dare to come to me a moment?
Certainly. Goodbye, Mr. Holmes.
Goodbye, Colonel.
I'm sorry I interrupted you, Mr. Holmes, but you seem so interested in tigers, I thought you were never going to stop.
They interest me. The stark ferocity, the cold cruelty. Very human beings are like tigers, you know.
Now I suppose you're back to your Moriarty theory. You're not going to try and tell me that this is his handiwork?
Well, who knows?
That man has become an obsession with him.
He is. Mrs. Dare, I want to offer you my very sincere sympathy.
It was a ghastly shock to me. I can imagine what it must have been to you.
I won't keep you a minute, Mr. Dare. Won't you sit down? When did you last see your brother?
At 6:30. He came in to dress, and I came in here to give him a message.
What was the message?
I told him that Mr. Holmes wanted to see him before he went to Paris. You see, I had asked Mr. Holmes to interview him.
What did he say?
He was upset. In fact, we had rather a quarrel about it.
Another quarrel? You had one the night before.
Yes, but this was not so serious. He was merely annoyed that I had spoken to Mr. Holmes.
He was very annoyed?
Well, rather. He seemed more frightened than annoyed. I couldn't understand.
And so you quarreled again?
Well, yes. He said I had no business to interfere in his affairs.
And did you again threaten to shoot him?
Shoot him? What do you mean?
The night before, your butler heard you threatening him.
Oh, no. I never did anything of the kind. I shoot Ronnie.
You said you would rather put a bullet through his head than own a brother who...
Oh, that was only a figure of speech. I was
A
accusing him of
most
something.
unfortunate figure of speech, considering that within 24 hours he was found with a bullet through his head.
But you don't think that
No, miss. But I must ask you to come along with me after I've finished my investigation.
I say, Lestrade, this is grotesque. Holmes, listen. Here's Lestrade suggesting that Miss Adair...
No, Dr. Watson, I didn't. All I want is her to come along and make a statement.
I'm sure Miss Adair will be delighted to go with you, Lestrade. It is quite a warm night.
Anything you say, of course.
Thanks, miss. I shall be ready in a minute.
Then I'll go and put on my things. If you have no more questions.
No, nothing else, thanks.
This is outrageous.
Well, Mr. Holmes, what do you think?
It's really remarkable how many varieties of trees there are in the London parks. Have you ever noticed what remarkably fine specimens?
Really, Mr. Holmes, you're a most extraordinary man. In the middle of an investigation like this, you begin talking about trees.
Holmes, you've heard Lestrade's ghastly accusation. Surely it was suicide. He burnt his correspondence.
I don't think he did. These are the ashes of, I should say, at least a dozen packs of playing cards.
Because he was afraid Fisher was going to expose him.
My dear Watson, as I've already told you, this was murder. And it was committed from outside this room.
What? Shot through the keyhole?
Ronald Adair burnt those playing cards, and they caused a great deal of smoke. He opened the window and sat down to write that confession. And the moment he sat down, he was shot from outside.
But how? From this height, you can hardly see the street. He would have had to have been hanging out of the window. And he wasn't. He was sitting in that chair. And you're suggesting that somebody stood in the middle of Park Lane between 10 and half past and fired a rifle? It would have had to have been a rifle to carry as far as this. And that nobody saw or heard anything, though there must have been hundreds of passers-by.
Yes, passers-by there undoubtedly were. But as you've doubtless already ascertained, there were no police about.
I beg your pardon, Mr. Holmes. There are always police about. There were a couple on point duty at Stanhope Gate.
I find on inquiry that 3 separate disturbances occurred at precisely 10:15 in this neighborhood tonight. A lot of roughs who are not accustomed to frequent the public house round the corner refused to leave and were ejected by the police. A young woman drove a car into a lorry about 100 yards up the road, and there was a false alarm of fire in Harford Street. It's curious that all these things should have been absolutely simultaneous.
But even supposing the police were occupied, you can't stand and fire a rifle into a Park Lane window without somebody having seen and heard something?
How true. Do you know a hornbeam when you see one?
A hornbeam?
There are some remarkably fine specimens in the park.
What is a hornbeam?
The Latin name is carpinus. They're common in the temperate zones of Asia and some parts of southern England. It looks like a beech, but it isn't.
You know, Dr. Watson, in spite of the fact that I've known Holmes for some years, I sometimes wonder if he's all there.
Put this in your mouth for a few minutes.
Whatever for?
I don't think you're at all well.
Oh, nonsense, my dear Watson, nonsense. I'm in the very best of health, in spite of a couple of nasty shocks.
When did you have a shock?
Well, I said 2. During the stroll I took this afternoon, I was just going to cross the Marylebone Road. The policeman on point duty was holding up the traffic. when a two-horse van, apparently out of control, whizzed round the corner and was on me in a flash. I sprang to the pavement and saved myself by the fraction of a second.
Good heavens.
Yes. 10 minutes later, a brick fell from the roof of the house. It was shattered at my feet. They were repairing the roof at the time, but the police proved it was an accident. I know better.
Oh, very nasty indeed.
Mm.
But these things happened this afternoon. I was worrying about you in the early hours of the morning.
Mm-hmm. What did I do?
Do? In the middle of a terribly serious conversation, you started talking about trees in the park and the difference between a hornbeam and a beech, altogether disconnected. And I thought a little delirious.
Yes, I did ramble a bit, didn't I?
And I'm sorry you made what Lestrade called a bombastic statement,
Mm-hmm.
that within 24 hours, 12 of which, by the way, have already gone, you would have the murderer. No, it wasn't at all like you, Holmes.
No, he did look as if I were very ill, didn't he?
It gives Lestrade such a chance to crow. He thinks he's done a frightful lot and you nothing.
Mhm.
He's disposed of my suicide theory
And made an arrest. Who? I wonder he hasn't arrested you or Mrs. Hudson.
and he never stops talking about this mythical Moriarty.
Now listen, my dear Watson. I have established to my own satisfaction that in both the Reichsbank and the commercial bank cases, forged notes were substituted for real ones.
Well?
I have also established to my own satisfaction, and through the missing suitcase, that Ronald Adair was to have taken those English notes to Paris. And the same brain that planned that scheme planned the removal of Ronald Adair.
But why should they remove their means of getting the notes safely out of the country?
Because Ronald Adair refused at the last minute.
Why should he? He was still open to exposure as a cheat. That's what frightened him.
Yes, yeah, but I frightened him still more. When his sister told him that I wanted to see him, he was panic-stricken, but he realized that his cheating could only result in scandal. The other meant certain jail.
I see. And what did you make of that letter he was writing about the Sleeping Cardinal?
Now that, my dear Watson, is the most significant aspect of the case. Do you remember 8 months ago when Trimble the forger was found on the embankment dying from terrible injuries?
Yes? Yes?
Yeah. Yes, now, we mustn't forget your appointment.
Appointment?
Yes, it's necessary for me to remain alone a little while. So you, my dear Watson, are going to Euston.
Euston? Whatever for? What's the idea?
You'll see. You're going to have a busy night. Now, I want you to put on your coat and hat, take a suitcase, you needn't pack anything, get a taxi, and make a great fuss about getting it. Call Euston to the driver and tell him if he doesn't hurry, you'll miss the Scotch Express.
The Scotch Express?
Yes. You'll be followed. The moment you get to Euston, pay off the taxi and rush round to the booking office.